This is Cato Weekly Video. No Child Left Behind is warming up for reauthorization, but what has its record been for improving student achievement? Andrew Coulson is director of the Cato Institute's Center for Educational Freedom. He says NCLB's results have been poor at best. He spoke at a Capitol Hill briefing with U.S. Representative Scott Garrett September 5, 2007. This is a segment of a longer video available at our website, cato.org.
Certainly NCLB's advocates have been claiming since 2004, just 2 years after the law was passed, that it was really doing some good, that it was raising achievement overall, that it was closing the gaps. But we don't have to rely on the opinions of the law's advocates. We can look at the test scores. A lot of studies have been done, the most recent of which was by the Center on Education Policy, and it was just released a couple of months ago. They looked at state test scores, and they found that some state test score trends show improvement since NCLB was passed. And they also found that of the data, of the states for which they had data, more achievement gaps were shrinking than were growing. So this looks pretty favorable. This looks like it supports the views of NCLB advocates. But there are some limitations with the CEP study, some of which the authors themselves are ready to acknowledge. The biggest problem is that it's not nationally representative. Their study only had data for before and after NCLB for just 13 states. It also had the data, in most cases, for just a couple of years before NCLB passed. And when you want to establish how NCLB affected pre-existing trends, you have to know what the pre-existing trend was. So if you've only got 2 years, it's hard to do that. And finally, as the authors of the report themselves acknowledge, these are high-stakes state tests. There's a big incentive for teachers to teach narrowly to the curriculum they know is going to be on those tests, and thereby inflate the test scores without really guaranteeing that the students have learned anything more. And I reviewed the literature on teaching to the test 4 or 5 years ago, and it's really pretty negative. It's really pretty surprising how much of a problem teaching to the test is on these high-stakes state tests. So fortunately, there are a number of other studies which are better designed and can tell us a lot more about the NCLB's effects. The best one was done by Jae-Kyung Lee at Harvard in 2006, last September. And Lee had nationally representative data from the NAEP, the NAEP, also known as the Nation's Report Card, and he had it as far back as 1990. So he was able to establish a really good pattern of achievement before NCLB was passed and compare that to the results after it was passed. Well, what Lee found was that it doesn't appear to have helped achievement overall, and it doesn't appear to have narrowed the achievement gaps. Now, this isn't just Lee's finding. There have been other reports that have looked at the NAEP scores and NCLB's effect on them, including one by Bruce Fuller and his colleagues that just came out earlier this year. And once again, they find that NCLB did not improve on pre-existing trends in student achievement. There are some continuing gains in math, according to Fuller and his colleagues, but they're slower gains. The rate of improvement in these test scores is slower than it was before the law was passed. So not encouraging for NCLB supporters. There are a couple of other studies that I'd like to go over. Neither of these is nationally representative, but they're both interesting for their own reasons. One of them that has gotten very little press was an interesting study by the Northwest Evaluation Association. This is a private organization, a nonprofit that provides testing services to school districts. So they have a lot of nitty-gritty data from 23 states on student achievement before and after NCLB. Rather than just looking at test scores at one point in time, they looked at how much students gained in learning over a year, the year 2001, 2002, and 2003, 2004. And what they found is that students learned more in that earlier year before NCLB passed than they did in 2003, 2004 after it had passed. Now again, this isn't nationally representative, but the NWEA did have data for almost twice as many states as the CEP study, so it certainly gives us a better idea than the CEP study about what NCLB's effects are. The last of the studies I'll mention is probably the most poorly designed. It isn't nationally representative, and it only had data for a handful of states. It's not a before and after study. There was no trend data for how students were doing before NCLB, so you really can't tell anything from this study about the NCLB's effects. So why am I listing it here? Well, for the irony factor, really. this was a background paper on NCLB effects that was included or was conducted by the Aspen Commission. Now, if you're into NCLB and you follow it, you may remember the Aspen Commission report, which was a big, thick report on NCLB that came out earlier this year. And that report suggested some tweaks to the law, but overall was pretty supportive of it and said, you know, it's doing some good, scores are up. They don't actually mention that their own background study found no real pattern of clear effects from NCLB. Some achievement gaps got bigger, some smaller, some were unchanged. Their own study didn't support the findings or the conclusions that they'd drawn.
Andrew Coulson is the director of the Cato Institute's Center for Educational Freedom. More videos are available at our website, cato.org.